Hello and welcome. This is the Carbon Watchdog podcast. Hello and welcome to the Carbon Watchdog podcast. My name's Adam Hardy, and you can support Carbon Watchdog on Patreon. If you go to the website, you'll find a link in the top menu there. On this podcast today, I have Hugh White, who is a trustee of Open Carbon Data, which is a charity promoting carbon footprinting. Hugh is a Canadian-born UK citizen, and he lives in Finsbury Park, North London, down the road from me. And one of the reasons I've got him on the podcast today is because his grandfather, Archibald White, lived in Calgary and was the proprietor of Wilson Coal and Coke, which had a very interesting history, which we will now discuss. And so welcome, Hugh. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. It's been some time since I've had an opportunity to bore people.
Well, I'm sure you won't, because you regaled me with some stories, which basically were interesting to the point where I thought we had to get this down onto a podcast, because there's just stuff about the old ways of doing things before climate change was ever an issue, before anybody thought that there might be a problem. Well, actually, to tell you the truth, science and academia has known for a hell of a long time about climate change being a problem, but the general population didn't have a clue and didn't know anything about the dangers of rising CO2 right up until the UN climate conferences began in the 1990s. So when you were in Calgary, growing up and a teenager and a young man in the 50s and 60s, nobody would have had the slightest objection to burning fossil fuels on any sort of global climate basis at all. There was probably a fair amount of smog and that kind of stuff going on. Well, at least there was in London. I've no idea about Calgary, but the thing that stuck in my memory was this vision of your grandfather, with his huge amount of coal and coke, which is essentially coal that they use for blast furnaces. Is that correct?
Yeah.
In huge mounds, getting covered in coal dust and transporting it around the neighborhood to everybody, all and sundry, who needed basically to just keep warm in winter and keep the stoves going. And it's essentially the foundation of the whole economy, of the whole, not just the business and so on, but also the domestic, the whole domestic. Everybody was burning coal just to keep themselves going, keep themselves warm, keep the cookers going.
Yeah. Just to put it into some sort of context, that Western Canada was settled really comparatively recently. It had to wait until the railway was built, and the railway was finished in around 1880s, 1890s. And it wasn't until then that there was really very many people living in Western Canada. But when the railway arrived, cities started growing. And I was born in Calgary, in Alberta, which is within sight of the Rocky Mountains. It's in the foothills, and on the edge of the prairies. And something that, unless you've actually been brought up in an area like the Canadian prairies, it's worth emphasizing just how very, very, very big it is. It is an impression of infinity.
The horizon, or the landscape?
The landscape, that the prairies are, you could travel 600 miles from Calgary going east, and it would be exactly the same as it was just when you left Calgary. It's just a huge monotonous landscape. As you move towards the Rocky Mountains, lots of forest, beautiful scenery, but it goes on endlessly. You have the feeling that the natural resources are quite literally infinite. And of course, the people who came into this part of the West, as opposed to the people who had it before in the early days, they just had the feeling that nothing they would do or could do would damage it. Now that penny dropped, but in the early days there was this feeling of infinite resources. And sorry?
Do you think that's prevalent today as well? Because I often think that the reason why people in North America, Canada, and the US probably don't buy into climate change is just because they have so much wilderness out there. It's not like in London where your nose is up against the coalface the whole time, to use a bad metaphor, but you can't get away from the environmental impact that London has on the environment, obviously. So what you're saying is in Calgary, or at least out and about around Calgary, you just felt like you're in this limitless wilderness where nature is never going to be affected by what you do.
And it's a bit like the Mad Hatter's Tea Party. You know, if one place setting is finished, you just move on to the next. And that penny has now started to drop because of the thawing in the Antarctic, wildfires all over the place, climate change generally. So, you know, the message is getting across. But the starting point is very different from Europe, because there really was this feeling that the resources were infinite. And they were there for capitalist entrepreneurs to make the best use of them and make lots and lots of money. And
did that impact you as a teenager, or is that just some sort of conclusion that you would have when you'd finished school and people were saying, "Oh, well, Hugh, you know, what job are you going to do?" Is it sort of was it pretty much, well, the wilderness is out there for the taking, so it's something I'm gonna, or is it not quite that? I'm getting this impression of these land, what were they called, a land rush? No, a land grab. Where not a land grab. Where you could there would be a race and you just ride off on your horse and stake out your land, and that would be yours.
Yeah, they did that in the States. In Canada, they were much more organized about it. But when they built the railway actually opened an office in London. I think it's somewhere near Trafalgar Square. And they actually wanted people to move to the Canadian prairies. And so they offered them, with the complicity of the Canadian government, for paying $10, which was more than it is now, but it wasn't a huge amount of money. You could become a homesteader, and you could get a patch of land that became yours. And this is a really big patch of land. You know, one person would have a patch about the size of the whole Finsbury Park area.
I love that.
It became yours if you lived on it for 3 years and grew something. And of course, it was in the interest of the railways to have lots of farmers producing meat and grain, that there was freight for the railways. Right. Because the railways had been built predominantly as a political move to unify Canada. Because when Canada was first formed, the only way of getting from the East Coast to the West Coast by train was to go into the United States and take a rather convoluted journey to British Columbia. So the first thing the Canadian government did was set up the Canadian Pacific Railway Company, I think it was, and build a railway across Canada. And that took a lot of funding. It's a huge distance. And
what year did they do that in? Presumably before you were born.
I actually looked it up. It was well before me. The first locomotive hit Alberta in 1883. So it was really quite a long time. Canada was founded in 1867. So it took a long time to unify it with the railway. And the railways, of course, needed huge amounts of coal. So coal mining was driven by the railways. The railways drove the increase in population to provide freight for their trades that needed the coal. And so it was a feedback system that worked quite successfly.
Where were the coal mines? Were there any near you, or was it all freighted in?
Yes, that Alberta is just on the edge, or at least the western part of the province, is next to the Rocky Mountains. In fact, part of the Rocky Mountains fall within the province. Most of them are in British Columbia. And there's a lot of coal in the mountains and the area of the foothills and Alberta generally. Huge coal reserves. The first coal was mined in Alberta, not too close to the mountains actually, in about the early 1860s to provide coal for heating. Then coal was discovered in the Rocky Mountains in several spots. And of course, for it to be useful, it had to be convenient to the railway. And so the coal mines that developed were those that could gain access to the first railway, which went through Calgary, through the Kicking Horse Pass. And then later on, they built a railway to the north, which is called the Yellowhead Pass, which goes through Edmonton and then through the Rockies at Jasper. And in all of these areas, they found coal. The coal near Calgary was very high quality, so ideal for almost any purpose. And a coal mine grew up at a town called Canmore. And I actually did a bit of homework. I didn't know this. Canmore is from a Scottish dialect that means big head. And it was named after King Morgan III of Scotland, who was known as the Big Head. Most of Western Canada was named, parts of it anyway, were named by Scots. And I think they were running low on names at that point. Anyway, Canmore had a coal mine that functioned until the 1970s, when it finally closed. And
used by the trains.
Sorry?
Used by the railways, mostly.
Yes, and my grandfather set up, when he'd moved to Western Canada, I'm not quite sure what he did originally, but he decided that the future was coal, and he set up a company, Wilson Coal and Coke, to provide coal for heating, domestic heating, businesses, and that sort of thing. And he was very successful at it. He had an area, if you think around Finsbury Park, tube station, most of the area that is from the tube station to Rowan's up to the World's End pub, that sort of block, Well, my grandfather's coal yard was bigger than that, or roughly the same size, and it was just on the railway. The trains would come dump the coal.
Right, so
Then
we
he
had
would,
several acres then, or
yeah,
hectares.
yeah, it was a big site, um, and he had various offices. It had all disappeared by the time I became sort of sentient. But there were a couple of old wooden office buildings that were still there, and I explored those and found a gas analysis apparatus uh, that you could carry around, and presumably to show that the coal was of good quality, they would do an analysis of what you got when you burned it. So you'd get carbon dioxide, of course, predominantly, but you could also get hydrogen sulfide and contaminating materials. And so the gas analysis kit seemed to be part of the selling coal. I don't know. I never asked him about it, but I did find this box of decayed rubber tubing and bits of glassware.
This portrays your passion for science, because
Yes.
what I didn't say in the introduction is that your career was as a biochemist.
Yes.
And so gas analysis would be right up your street.
Yes, it was an interesting piece of apparatus. But in the days when my grandfather was selling coal, and coke was used, as there was no steel smelting in Western Canada, but it was used for blacksmithing, and it was also a high quality fuel. If people didn't want too much fume and what have you in a hotter fire, they would use coke. So posher people would have coke for their fires rather than coal.
Oh, so it's more expensive.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So is that so? What's the difference? Because you think about coal, and you think, well, it's this black stuff that gets everything really dirty, and you burn it. Is coke essentially the same thing, except for slightly denser, or?
Well, what they do is to make coke, you enclose the coal in a metal vessel, and then you heat it. And the heating drives off the volatiles, the hydrocarbons that produce, ultimately would be oil and gas.
Right.
And you drive all of this out of the coal,
yeah,
leaving the carbon. So coke is a much purer form of carbon, and it burns at a higher temperature and with a cleaner flame. So if you have a coke fire, you have a better chance of being able to smelt iron.
Right.
Because it's easy to get a hot fire. Sometimes it's actually after you've turned it into coke, they may crush it and form it into little briquettes using a bit of clay as a binder. But it was a more speciality fuel. And of course, correspondingly cost more. The distillate from the production of coke was usually just vented into the atmosphere. But if you condensed it, you could get some light hydrocarbons that you could probably use industrially or burn them as lamp oil or something. I'm not aware that it was ever much done.
So essentially, it was just that sort of stuff. A lot of that stuff would be the methane for sure would be some big global warming gas. Yeah.
But,
so how did your grandfather get into the coal industry, the coal business? Was it basically just this massively profitable operation? if you can get into it, then you grab the chance with both hands and you're on the gravy train.
Probably. I've never found out. I believe that when he was born in Ontario from a family that had been living near the American border since way before Canada formed. Yeah. I think they emigrated there from Ireland sometime in the 1700s.
Right.
And his family had produced generations of medical doctors until my grandfather, and for some reason or the other, my grandfather didn't fancy an academic life. And he went west, you know, as I said, go west, young man. He picked up a bride before they went west.
Okay.
From a rather posh family. And they ended
become a doctor, no doubt.
Well, they ended up in Calgary, and I believe he started speculating in property. He probably had a bit of money to do initial investment, but he was a very able businessman and a very clever man. Positively evil, but definitely a clever man. And he recognized that coal was going to be a useful thing to make money on.
Yeah.
And so he invested in it and developed Wilson Coal and Coke. And it was quite successful with branches in other cities in the province. And
so how did he, how many, was it mainly a business thing, or was it mainly a domestic thing, or was it just anybody who wanted it?
Anybody who wanted it. I think he probably, so for domestic use, people would have the coal delivered. And so there was probably a middleman who would buy the coal from my grandfather and deliver it to individual houses, whereas companies would buy direct from him.
Yeah.
And a story that I told you before that was rather amusing, that when one of the companies that bought coal from him, a Dutch family who had set up glass houses. Now, the Canadian winters are really extreme, even in Calgary, which is a bit milder than further north. But periods of minus 20 degrees Celsius for extended periods are normal in the winter, and a lot of snow as well. And so, of course, the greenhouses used a lot of heating. And the Dutch family, they were called Brick Brothers. And then, of course, when the Great Depression happened, people stopped buying flowers and buying fresh lettuces and everything else because they didn't have any money.
Right.
And the Brick Brothers were in severe trouble because they couldn't afford to pay my grandfather for his coal. And my grandfather, rather than foreclosing on them, said, right, well, things are going to get better one day.
Yeah.
So when you can afford to pay me, pay me. Until then, you have as much coal as you need. So he put...
He's a nice guy. I thought you said before you were saying that he's an evil chap.
But he recognized that these guys were going to be successful. And sure enough, they were. And when the Depression was over, they went from strength to strength and built more and more glass houses. They paid off their debts to him. He gained a lot of goodwill.
Right. Okay.
And they supplied bedding plants to him free of charge until he died. So I didn't realize you had to pay for plants until, after he died. So, I thought you just rang up the Brink Brothers and they would bring the plants to you.
So Brink Brothers had a lot of greenhouses?
Yeah, acres.
And they heated them all the way through winter, all the way through this, when it was minus 20
Yeah,
outside. They would keep these greenhouses going.
yeah. And single
Blimey.
glaze greenhouses as well. You know, it's a
Must be
really expensive thing.
insanely inefficient as well.
Oh, yeah.
But the coal
Um,
was
but
the coal was expensive. It wasn't
well, coal
so
was
cheap
cheap.
that they didn't realize.
Well, that, you know, you could do it, and in a normal economy, uh, it wasn't a problem. But then when everything went pear-shaped with the Great Depression, then it was. And in fact, my grandfather was in financial trouble at one point. Again, the details I never did find out. But the family were kept going in part by my grandmother, who was a pianist. And she gave piano lessons. And people would pay for piano lessons by barter. So you could get half an hour piano tuition for a dozen eggs. And if you wanted an hour, I think it was a whole chicken. And so she kept the food on the table simply by teaching piano. And that, you know, reduced the family's bills.
So this Great Depression was the same Great Depression that they had in America, presumably.
Yeah. And
after the massive stock market crash in 1929,
yes.
and then the whole of the 30s before the Second World War,
yeah,
was just this miserable time with nothing happening and nothing happened. The economy was just flat.
Yeah. And the other thing that happened was they had the great drought in the Dust Bowl years, when the topsoil, particularly in the United States, just blew away.
Yeah.
And this was less of a problem in Canada, but certainly there was a massive failure of agriculture.
Yeah.
So, you know, it was a bad time.
Yeah.
But things got better. And when things started to get better, one of the things that was becoming of interest was they'd found natural gas fairly close to Calgary. In fact, it had been known for some time, an area called Turner Valley. And by the 1920s, Turner Valley was producing both natural gas and oil. And my grandfather realized that people weren't going to want to heat their houses with coal, because it was going to be so easy to pipe gas in.
Mm-hmm.
And so he quietly slowed down his selling of coal and coke and set up a company called Wilson Electric, which handled gas and electrical appliances. Initially, he was selling gas appliances, including gas-operated refrigerators, which you can still buy.
Mm-hmm.
They're probably not very common these days, but when the electricity supply is not reliable and gas supply was better, it was, you know, quite a good option. And my grandfather set up the Wilson Electric, and he used the same premises for his warehouses as he'd used to store coal, because again, they were right on the railway, so he could import white goods, cookers and refrigerators, and later televisions and what have you.
Sounds like a dire combination there, having the coal on one side of the warehouse and white goods on the other side.
Yes, but it worked. And he then bought a building right in the center of the city for his offices, a piece of prime real estate. And again, he was distributing white goods for most of the Canadian prairies, very successful. And I remember they were offered an early microwave oven. And this was really a novelty. It cost an enormous amount of money.
Wow. What year would that have been?
Oh, God, it would have been probably in the 50s. It was around about the time television came into Western Canada. And it was about the size of a washing machine. And
wow.
Instead of the round window we have on a washing machine, there was a small square window. And you opened this up, and there was a little space about that big that was sufficient to put a hot dog in, or 2 or 3 hot dogs. And you could cook your hot dogs in this microwave oven. And it was, a huge piece of kit, weighed the earth, but it did cook hot dogs. My grandfather said, "It'll never catch on." And for quite a while he was right. But eventually they made microwave ovens that are much more convenient.
Yeah, we got, I remember as a child, my parents getting a microwave oven, and they tried out cooking various things in the microwave oven just to experiment with it. And the one that I remember most was the egg. I'm not sure whether the instructions said don't cook eggs in this oven, but it might have done. And my dad just thought, well, let's see what happens.
Yes.
And of course, it exploded.
Yeah.
Which I thought was great fun.
Yes, and it's devilish to clear out afterwards. Yeah, but my grandfather's business eventually failed through competition and through his growing old and poorly, and his son, who took over the
An
business, was a frightfully nice guy.
An uncle?
My uncle, yes. And he had very little competence in business. And the business was largely kept going by my father, who had married the boss's daughter, it must be said. My father was an accountant and ran the finances of the company. And after my grandfather sort of faded from the picture, my father kept the company afloat, but of course he wasn't the managing director. And when my father died, the company just went bankrupt because the banks didn't trust my uncle.
No.
So, we didn't inherit a vast amount of money. But it was an interesting saga of how capitalism worked in the Wild West. And my grandfather was a most impressive man, a very practical man. He didn't like to waste money. When he realized that I was interested in science, and seriously interested in science, he was prepared to invest in apparatus. So I had a basement laboratory.
Wow.
But it took quite a while before he decided that somebody was serious and so was worth spending a bit of money on.
Yeah.
He'd also been keen on photography, and he took and developed his own black and white pictures. And then he branched out into cinefilm. And he had one of the first Kodak 16mm cine cameras in Western Canada. And he took pictures of everything. And including the coal mines at Canmore, Alberta. And also pictures of family when my mother was just a little girl. The family going camping in the foothills and on the Rocky Mountains up towards Banff. And this was before there was actually a metalled road between Calgary and Banff. The only road was a couple of ruts in the ground, but a Model T could just about make it. But most people would ride horses to get there. But my grandfather used his Model T, and we have these old cine films in black and white of camping, of the early coal mines at Canmore with pit ponies. Seemed quite well cared for.
Did you get any of them transferred onto video?
No. When my grandfather died, there was this huge amount of cine film. Most of it, of course, was when he branched out into color. Then it tended to be family films of children, you know, endless, very boring family films.
Yeah.
But the interesting historical ones were deposited with the Glenbow Museum in Calgary and are part of the historical record there.
Oh, right, okay.
So in fact, I looked at their website, but you have to subscribe to actually get at the full index of what they've got. They also had my mother's bridal dress. Because my mother's bridal dress incorporated lace that had come from her mother's family in Eastern Canada, the ones I described as posh, and it had gone back a very long time. I don't know how old it was, but it was of historical interest. And so the museum has got my mother's bridal gown as well.
Great history lesson.
Well,
have you been back there at all?
Very rarely. I'm not an outdoors person. The scenery is beautiful, but a little goes a long way. Both of my parents were into winter sports. They skied, they snowshoed, they skated. My father played hockey. They played tennis. My father played football. You name it, they did it. They produced 2 academic children who had no interest whatsoever in it. They were very frustrated. And most of the relatives I have fell out of touch with or died off. So I now have 2 cousins extant, one of whom has dementia so badly that she might as well be dead. And the other is still functioning, about my age. And, you know, we exchange emails, but I haven't been back to Canada since 1986.
Oh, right, okay. Yeah.
So, you know, it's largely remote control.
Yeah.
But going back to the sort of the attitude towards energy, that in the days when my grandfather was selling coal, it was really cheap. And so you didn't worry about insulating your house. And I was brought up in a house that was built by my grandfather, which was similar to lots of other houses. It was wood frame construction with a commodious basement, which was a good idea.
What I don't understand about that is that, I mean, in my experience, when you have a badly insulated house, a bit like the one I'm living in, when you turn the heating off, then you immediately get cold.
Yeah, you
And
just don't turn the heating off.
yeah, but if you want to be warm again, you have to go and turn it on again. I always thought that it just doesn't make any sense not to insulate because you want to stay warm. And okay, so you could theoretically keep the heating running all the time, but then again, you've got to go out to the coal. What are they called? These
The coal yard, the coal was actually kept in the cellar.
right. So you've got to go down to the cellar, get a whole bunch of coal, and chuck it on the fire.
Yeah,
Who wants to do that? Why do you make more work for yourself when you're
you could with a bit of insulation.
yeah.
I don't know. That they did heat the house virtually continuously.
So they did that anyway.
During the winter.
I mean, I could see that somebody might invent some sort of automatic, some sort of conveyor belt which produces a continual conveyor belt of coal that drops into the oven. Or
there was some sort of automatic hopper, so the furnace would be kept up. You had to fill the hopper once a day. So once you'd filled the hopper for the day, then it was automatically fed into the furnace. I don't know how. I don't know what mechanism.
Okay, then I'm putting my modern memories of my well, they're not that modern, but I'm putting my memories of the coal fire that we used to have in my house when I was a kid, and it was just because it was just a hearth in under a fireplace, and really it wasn't for heating the house much. I mean, it heated the room that you're in, but it was so much fuss. You had to go and get the coal. Everything would get dirty. You'd have to chuck it on the fire, and then afterwards you'd have to clean all the ash out, and that was twice as dirty again.
Yeah.
Carry it all out, and it was just untold hassle to actually look after that. So you'd be sitting there getting a bit cold and thinking, why is this stupid central heating not working? Shall we put the fire on? And half of the time you go, no, I can't be bothered. It's just so much hassle. But I presume if you have some sort of furnace with some sort of automated mechanism that keeps it going, then much better way of doing it.
It was an impressive gadget. It was about a cylinder, maybe 5 foot in diameter, and it stood just about my height in the basement, and it drove hot water for the radiators. And every room had an old cast iron radiator.
Yeah.
And, I can never remember being cold when I was young.
Oh, I see.
The system just worked a treat. Now, when I knew it, it had been converted to gas. With the original boiler was still there, but where the coal feed had been put in, they'd inserted a huge gas burner.
Oh, right.
The burner was about that diameter.
Yeah.
And all sorts of complicated devices outside to control the flow of gas. And the whole thing was driven by thermostats. It was very inefficient, but it certainly worked. And
so you didn't actually have your house heated by coal at that.
No, the
when
coal,
you were a kid. It had already been converted over to gas.
It had been converted because, again, when my grandfather decided something was on the way out, he did have to have the most up-to-date, say, if these days he'd have the latest iPhone.
Right. Okay.
And so he converted quite early. And it was a very sophisticated conversion, whereas my father's mother had a similar sized house with a similar sized furnace. But there the conversion was very cheap. And all you did was turn on a big gas valve at that diameter, scrunch up a bit of newspaper and light it with a match and throw it in the door of the furnace, close the door and hope that it didn't blow up. And this was a hot air system, and it provided hot air continuously through the winter.
Right.
And it had originally, of course, been fired by coal as well.
Uh-huh.
And the size of the basements was driven by the necessity of being able to store sufficient coal for the winter.
Right.
Because you couldn't rely on regular deliveries, because when the snow was 6 or 8 feet deep, there would be periods when it was very difficult to get vehicles around. And in the days when they were horse-drawn, damn near impossible.
Didn't stand a chance, right? Yeah.
And I can remember when milk deliveries were done by horse and cart. And then, you just, in cold weather, you just didn't get your milk if there was too much snow.
Of course they would. Of course they would be going all winter.
Yeah.
Presumably from a dairy where all the cows are inside, heated by.
Yes, heated by coal. Yes. But then when gas came in, it was absolutely cheap. And petrol was very cheap. It still is by comparison with Europe.
Yeah.
And so there was never any reason for people to put in insulation.
Yeah.
And, they knew about insulation, and our house actually had a little bit of loft insulation. A couple of barrow loads of wood shavings had been dumped between the rafters up in the attic, about a layer less than an inch of wood shavings. And that was just a token.
So the other thing, obviously, if your boiler breaks down or your furnace breaks down in Canada and it's minus 20 outside, and you've got no insulation in the house, presumably within 2 to 3 hours, it'll be minus 20 indoors as well.
It'll be bloody cold, yes.
So what did you do? What would you do if that happened?
I don't know. I think we did have a fireplace so that you could heat the sitting room. The fire was only used on sort of feast days, but it was a workable fireplace. So there was one additional source of heat.
Right.
And of course, when I was young, things had been converted to gas, and you could turn on the gas oven and open the door and warm the kitchen that way.
Right.
But I think basically they worked upon the basis that almost anything in a simple system could be quickly fixed.
Right, makes sense.
And I simply don't ever recall anybody complaining about a central heating breakdown in the winter.
Uh-huh.
It must have happened, but it wasn't the sort of trauma that it is here.
You get the people upstairs have been complaining actually because their boiler broke down for 6 weeks. They had to because the landlord's absolutely rubbish.
Yeah. It's a different sort of attitude.
Yeah.
And I think it's the attitude that underlies quite a lot of North American attitudes still, that you just had an endless supply.
Right. Hugh, can you hear?
I can hear a trumpet, yes.
I can hear a trumpet too. I've told them I'm doing a podcast, but they don't care.
It adds a bit of amusement.
What I was going to do is at some point was try to segue in talking about houses into your house in Finsbury Park there. So do you have an old cellar that was once a coal cellar?
Yes. And of course we have fireplaces in every room.
Yeah.
The house was built in 1875, and we found the remains of the kitchen had its own chimney even, as all of these houses had. Okay. And we found the remains, the foundation of the the huge copper they used to heat water in.
Oh, right, okay.
Just the base of it, not the actual vessel itself.
Yeah.
And so the kitchen would have been coal-fired as well.
So that would be the primeval boiler, essentially.
Yeah.
Just with a coal fire underneath it.
Yeah.
Right. So
And
how many chimneys do you actually have then? Presumably you counted them at the top of the house.
Yeah, they're all in the garden now, growing plants. So let's see, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The main chimney had 6 chimney pots for this side of our house, right. And then the rear chimney for the kitchen had 2 chimney pots.
Right. Okay.
And when the house was built, the assumption was you had a maid, and we looked at the census for 1881, and for Wilberforce Road, virtually every house had a servant. But by the next census, many houses had lost their servants, so people were having to do their own stoking of the fires rather than having the maid do it. But the original design was the idea the maid would do it all.
Yeah. That's now changed into the maid's room becomes an au pair room, and the au pair looks after the kids. And yes. All of the coal has been replaced with central heating.
Yeah.
I can imagine that. Did you do a retrofit? Did you do any sort of have you done any sort of work on the place to get the increase the insulation, reduce the heating bills?
We did, but as soon as we moved in, we had to replace the central heating boiler, and it was very unsatisfactory installation, as the house had been divided into bed sits, and so there were independent central heating systems, all cobbled together. We found 17 separate consumer units for the electricity supply. The house had been converted back into a single family house by the people we bought it from.
Yeah.
But we found the remains. There were kitchens on every landing.
Right.
You find the holes for the pipes and the drains and what have you. There was an outdoor toilet as well as an inside toilet.
That's still going.
The outdoor toilet is now a garden shed.
Right.
But
so it's fairly typical of all London houses, basically. Yeah. They are just a disaster in terms of efficiency and insulation.
Yeah.
And they're made to be, I think the term is porous, made to be breezy. So yeah. The air has got to circulate so that you don't start getting damp and all of this kind of dry rot and wet rot, yeah. And mold creeping up the walls.
Yeah, you've got to have air bricks to let air into the cellar.
Yeah.
But after we dealt with the central heating initially, we had double glazed windows put in at the back of the house. And there was some loft insulation in place, but it had been very poorly mounted. They just sort of thrown the rolls about at random. And so I spent happy hours up in the loft, putting the insulation properly between the rafters, and then adding another layer. So the loft has about as much loft insulation as it's possible to get. Then did things like sealing, trying to reduce the drafts around the doors. The front windows were replaced with double glazed sash units. So we've done all of the easy things in terms of making it more energy efficient. And we really,
did you listen to the podcast that
yes,
I made with Kate Calgary?
Yes, it was fascinating.
She just basically they went to town and did the whole lot.
That I'd love to be able to do as much as she did, but now we're so thoroughly settled in the house and operating on pension budget, it's not really feasible. We did. I rebuilt the central heating system after we suffered from the original system with a new boiler, and it was still not very good.
Yeah.
So I rebuilt the system and had a decent Worcester Bosch boiler installed that was much, much more efficient than the one that had been fitted.
Yeah.
And that served us for 16 years, and we replaced it with a more efficient one. And it did make a significant savings to the gas bills.
Right.
And then,
well, I mean, the government is probably going to have to get everybody to dump their gas boilers. I can't really see any way around this. There is talk about hydrogen and mixing hydrogen and methane in the gas. I assume because they've done this conversion, they converted from they converted from land gas to North Sea gas back in the 1970s.
It was town gas.
Town gas. They figure they can do it again with hydrogen, maybe, but that's still not going to be. It's not really the real deal, is it? And
it's going to be bloody expensive. The latest Worcester Bosch boilers claim to be hydrogen friendly, that if there ever is a conversion to hydrogen or a mixed methane hydrogen fuel, they claim that the boiler won't have to be replaced.
Really?
Probably they'd have to tweak the adjustments, certainly.
Well, sorry, when was this that you installed this one?
Well, the present one was about 11 years ago, but I've been looking at the newer boilers. Those are the ones that are hydrogen compatible.
Oh, I see. So the one you've got isn't?
No.
Right,
and when I spoke to the serviceman doing the annual service, I said, I'm thinking of replacing this beast. And he said, well, his advice would be not to, because there might be grants in the future.
Yeah.
And at 10 or 11 years old, the boiler was going to be maintained by Bosch for an indefinite period into the future.
Yeah.
So there was no worry about not being able to get parts.
Yeah.
So I put on the back burner, as it were, replacing the boiler.
Right.
But I dislike the idea of an inefficient boiler. This one is certainly more efficient than the ones that went before.
We think the boiler that we've got is about 25 years old.
Yeah.
And of course, the landlord isn't going to replace it.
No.
He didn't even want to replace it after Islington Council offered him essentially about 75% of the costs.
Cool.
He still couldn't be bothered, basically.
Yeah. But it's a false economy. I'm a bit skeptical about hydrogen as a fuel. I'd really want to see a lot of tests, because hydrogen is has a very high diffusion constant.
Yeah.
And it will diffuse more rapidly through tiny little gaps that methane won't. And hydrogen is, as is methane, but very explosive. And
Yeah.
I'm a bit worried about the safety risk. Um,
I did read up on this, and I was talking to some guy, and he was basically saying, well, the thing about hydrogen is that because it disperses so well, it won't
yeah,
actually pool in.
yes, that's true.
It won't collect in a sort of a Zeppelin-sized
Hmm.
bubble and then explode
Yeah,
disastrously like the Hindenburg did.
yes,
Because that, I mean, that's every time you talk about hydrogen with most people, is they envisage the Hindenburg Zeppelin going up in flames,
yeah,
and so I really don't know, but I do see that I am a bit skeptical that it can be brought in time to meet the climate targets that
yes.
everybody wants to hit, because
And the other,
there is no hydrogen out there being produced, just small
yeah,
amounts from prototype hydrogen generators, mostly running off fossil fuels. So they're generating it using fossil
yes,
fuels rather,
yeah,
and so they don't even have the wind farms or the solar farms available to produce the hydrogen at the power plants, even if they could do that, which they can't anyway. So
yeah,
it's just a vision at the moment.
yeah,
And so if you're going to replace people's boilers, then at the moment you would have to go for electric boilers. And
yeah,
then the problem with that is that electricity is far more expensive per kilowatt hour than gas. You get a lot more bang for your buck.
yeah,
Talking about bangs again with gas. I mean, I notice it when you look at your heating bill. We
yeah,
have relatively cheap bills because we have a gas boiler.
yeah.
But people who have electric boilers are going to be paying more.
But,
So yeah, it's a fraught situation, and
but
who knows what's going to happen. It's
yeah,
which is
and
why I keep banging on about the carbon currency. If you had a carbon currency where nobody has to make any decisions about it at a high level, because essentially it would just show in the
yeah,
carbon price on whatever it is. It would just show that is the way to do it right now. If you want to do it right now, then you just look at the carbon price.
yeah.
But anyway, that's
But,
a digression. The
well,
what I what I was going to say is basically we've got to the coming up to the hour, so I wanted to um, start concluding. And just say, well, thank you very much for all of those historical insights. I think my camera is not cutting out on me.
yes, it was.
And I'll put this all together and basically hopefully get a really good podcast out of it. I don't think I have to do very much to it,
Oh,
apart from just make sure that the trumpet wasn't too loud in the background there.
no, I think it was acceptable. I think the message I'd be driving home is just the attitude that people have being brought up in an area with apparently infinite resources, low prices for fuels. You have a very different mindset. And the other point that I didn't make is that fossil fuels are a really major part of the Canadian economy. And
Even now, right?
even now,
Yeah,
and Alberta is doing a huge amount of environmental damage by extracting oil from the tar sands in Alberta.
yeah,
Because extracting the oil is extremely difficult, very polluting, and is only feasible when the oil price is high.
yeah,
And the other thing I noticed is that Canada, for 50 years, had a legislative moratorium on having open pit coal mining. So, you can't just dig up a huge section of land and dig out the coal. You have to mine it properly if you're going to mine it at all, which of course is much more expensive. And they've done away with that. They've reversed it in the past year. So you can now, there's a site in the prairies where coal is relatively accessible if they just clear away the topsoil. And so you'll have this great crater forming so they can get vast amounts of coal out.
But isn't tar sands the same thing? Isn't the operation for tar sands is that you just clear the landscape and then process all of the sands to get the fossil fuel out? Isn't that the same process, though?
It's not. It's more elaborate, because if you're doing an open pit mine for coal, you just have to clear away the topsoil and then dig out the coal. Whereas with the tar sands, you have to get to the tar sand layer, which is not very deep, and then you've got to dig it out. But then your tar sand, which is really just black, horrible, smelly sand, has to go into vast retorts, and the oil has to be forced out by steam and high temperature and God only knows what else. So it's open pit mining is bad enough, but tar sands is even worse because it's so polluting after you've got the stuff out.
So they have this, and of course tar sands affects huge areas as well. I've seen the aerial photographs.
Yeah.
It was just the legislative restrictions on open pit coal mining were purely coal.
Yeah, I think it might have been mining in general, but probably coal. And now, of course, there's energy prices going up, and they've done away with it.
Yeah.
So, a really retrograde step, I thought.
Well, Justin Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister, has got enjoys this really difficult position of trying to be green and say, oh yes, for the Paris Agreement, we're going to do this, that, and the other, and but then all of the Canadian states just go off and do these tar sands and open pit coal mines, and I really don't know. Looking from the outside, I've got really no idea whether Canada which direction it's heading at all. I just can't tell.
I think it's, and I don't follow it particularly, but I think it's heading towards continued use of fossil fuels.
Yeah.
I think it's making as many noises because, of course, Canadians on the whole, I think if you talk to individual Canadians, they'll be as keen as anybody on reducing fossil fuel use. But the Canadian economy is really hooked on it.
Right.
And so many jobs. Because when you look at Canada, aside from fossil fuels and mining and electricity and producing vast amounts of wheat, most of the country isn't really good for very much except looking at.
Yeah.
There's a narrow band where you can grow wheat. But when you go too far north, there's not a sufficient warm period for the wheat to ripen.
Right.
So despite new wheat varieties and, of course, warming, which is moving the warm area further north, but even so, there's a big hunk of Canada which doesn't really have any function except as land.
Just a huge wilderness.
Just a huge wilderness, which is the way I think most of us feel it should stay.
Yeah.
And go and look at it and enjoy it. Yeah. But that doesn't provide jobs for Canadians. So the government are really in a sticky position.
What about the idea of a massive renewable energy push? Getting solar farms, wind farms, hydropower, geothermal even. There must be loads of geothermal.
Yes. Yeah, I think if they got their act together, they could. The problem is that it's a federal system, and the provinces have enormous powers,
Yeah.
and the federal government can't really influence a lot of areas. And the Western, particularly Alberta, is so hooked on fossil fuels, they're going to make it difficult to invest in, say, geothermal.
Right.
Where, there's lots of relatively easily accessible hot springs in Banff. You could quite easily extract a lot of heat up there. But again, granted, it's a national park, so there are limits on that anyway. But Alberta is really hooked on oil and gas.
It is a difficult one, but you look at Norway, maybe, I don't know, but yeah, it's the old chestnut of the inertia behind the fossil fuel industry.
And not only the inertia, but the power of the big companies. The money and Imperial Oil more or less controlled northern Alberta, or big hunks of it. And going back to coal mining, the towns that were doing coal mining were actually owned by the coal companies.
Right. All the property, yeah.
All the property, they were the landlords, they ran the shops, everything.
Right.
So it's really difficult to cut that sort of tie.
Yeah.
And they use their financial power.
Use and abuse, definitely.
Yeah.
Look, Hugh, we've done. I think we've gone over 60 minutes. This is excellent. Thank you very much.
I'm sure you'll have a lot of editing to do.
At this point, the editing is way too much. Way too easy to make a complete hash of it and create much more work than it was actually worth. So I'm not going to edit it. And I don't think there's much need to, apart from maybe the trumpet. I'll have a listen to that again. So thank you very much, Hugh. And
well, thanks for listening. It's always nice to reminisce.
Yes, excellent. Thank you very much.
Right.
My name is Adam Hardy, and this is the Carbon Watchdog podcast. All of the website content and the podcasts are free. If you like what Carbon Watchdog is doing, then please head over to patreon.com using the link on the website and support me there. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you'll tune into the next one. Bye.